The crystal chandelier above table 17 had witnessed thousands of conversations, but none quite like the one unfolding beneath its fractured light on that Tuesday evening in March. Maya Rodriguez moved between the white cloth tables of Bellissimo with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to become invisible while remaining attentive, her notepad pressed against her hip, her smile genuine despite the ache in her feet after 9 hours of double shifts. She had exactly 43 minutes left before she could catch the crosstown bus, stop at the pharmacy for her mother's prescription, and still make it home in time to review the quarterly earnings reports she'd downloaded that morning. The restaurant hummed with the particular energy of old money and new deals. Bellissimo sat on the corner of 5th and Madison, its burgundy awning a landmark for those who measured success in reservation wait times and the discretion of its staff. Maya had worked here for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to the city with her mother, ever since the medical bills had started arriving in envelopes that seemed to grow heavier each month. The job paid her rent and her mother's treatments, but more importantly, it gave her something else: access to a world she studied like an anthropologist examining a foreign civilization. She approached table 17 with her water pitcher held at precisely the right angle, her posture conveying both respect and efficiency. The man seated there, Gordon Hastings III, according to the reservation book, though she would have recognized him even without that confirmation, was holding court with 2 other men in suits that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Gordon was 56, with silver hair swept back from a face that had the particular sheen of someone who'd never worried about money a single day in his life. His watch caught the light as he gestured, and Maya recognized it as a Patek Philippe, the kind featured in the finance magazines she devoured during her lunch breaks. "The biotech sector is finished," Gordon was saying, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to being right. "Overvalued, oversaturated, and over. I'm moving everything into commercial real estate. Property you can touch, buildings you can see. That's where smart money goes when the market gets uncertain." His companions nodded with the rhythm of those who had learned when agreement was more valuable than opinion. Maya refilled Gordon's water glass, her movements automatic, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating, analyzing, reconsidering the research she'd compiled over the past 6 months. She'd spent her limited free time building spreadsheets, tracking patterns, studying the biotech companies that Gordon was so casually dismissing. She'd noticed something, a convergence of factors that the major analysts seemed to be missing, buried in the footnotes of FDA approval pipelines and clinical trial data. "Excuse me, sir," Maya said, her voice quiet but clear. She immediately felt the temperature at the table shift, the way it always did when staff spoke beyond their prescribed function. "I couldn't help but overhear. Have you looked at the Phase 3 results for GeneMedix's leukemia treatment? Their data came out last week, and the efficacy rates are—" Gordon turned to look at her with an expression that wasn't quite irritation, but wasn't far from it. His pale blue eyes assessed her uniform, her name tag, the water pitcher in her hand, cataloging her as scenery that had momentarily forgotten its place. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," he said, his tone hovering between amusement and condescension, "but I have a team of analysts with Harvard MBAs who brief me on market movements. I think I'll trust their expertise over—" He gestured vaguely at her, the sentence finishing itself without words. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. She'd known this was a risk, breaking the invisible barrier between server and served, but something in his absolute dismissal of an entire sector bothered her. "Of course, Mr. Hastings. I just thought—" GeneMedix is partnered with Memorial Sloan Kettering for their trials, and the secondary endpoints showed tumor reduction in 83% of resistant cases. The FDA's fast-track designation means potential approval by 3rd quarter, and their current valuation doesn't reflect— "Sweetheart," Gordon interrupted, and that single word contained volumes. Every assumption, every dismissal, every wall she'd ever hit. "I've been investing since before you were born. Biotech is a casino, and the house always wins. Now we'd like to see the dessert menu." She placed the leather-bound menu on the table, murmured an apology, and retreated to the service station, where Carlos, the senior waiter, was polishing wine glasses with methodical precision. He was 62, had worked at Bellissimo for 30 years, and seen countless young servers make the mistake of thinking the guests wanted anything from them beyond impeccable service. "You okay, mija?" Carlos asked without looking up from his glass. "I'm fine," Maya said, though her hands were shaking slightly as she prepared the dessert tray. Sometimes I forget that what we know doesn't matter if we're the ones holding the water pitcher." Carlos finally looked at her, his weathered face kind. "You're the smartest person in this restaurant most nights, but smart doesn't change the uniform you're wearing. Save your advice for people who'll hear it. Or better yet, use it yourself." Maya nodded, but her gaze drifted back to table 17, where Gordon was signing the check with a flourish, his laughter booming across the dining room. She thought about the manila folder in her locker, the one stuffed with printed articles and handwritten notes about GeneMedix and 3 other biotech companies she'd been tracking. She thought about the $8,000 she'd saved over 2 years, money originally meant for community college tuition, before her mother's diagnosis had rearranged all priorities and possibilities. The thing about being invisible was that you saw everything. Over the past 3 years, Maya had served hedge fund managers and venture capitalists, senators and CEOs. She'd overheard merger talks and insider whispers. But more importantly, she'd learned to recognize the difference between people who actually understood their investments and people who simply had enough money to survive their mistakes. Gordon Hastings, despite his confidence and his Patek Philippe, belonged to the second category. She'd studied his portfolio, not through any illegal means, but through the public records required of anyone managing a fund above a certain threshold. Hastings' capital management had been profitable, certainly, but its returns over the past 5 years had been mediocre, propped up by the general market rise rather than any particular insight. He played it safe, followed consensus, and most tellingly, he'd missed the last 3 major sector shifts by clinging too long to conventional wisdom. After her shift ended, Maya changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom, pulling on jeans and the NYU sweatshirt she'd bought at a thrift store, a small act of aspiration for a school she'd never attended. She retrieved the manila folder from her locker, its edges worn from constant handling, and made her way through the kitchen where the late-night prep team was beginning their work. Miguel, the line cook who'd been trying to ask her out for 6 months, called out a goodbye that she returned with a distracted wave. The March air outside was cold enough to see her breath, the city wrapped in that particular evening darkness that came just before spring decided to stay. Maya walked the 6 blocks to the subway station, her folder pressed against her chest like a shield, her mind running calculations that had become as familiar as breathing. GeneMedix was trading at $47 per share. Her research suggested it should be valued closer to $120, maybe higher if their lead treatment received full FDA approval. With $8,000, she could buy approximately 170 shares. The pharmacy was crowded, filled with people as tired as she was, all of them waiting for small bottles that kept larger tragedies at bay. She picked up her mother's medications, the ones insurance covered and the one it didn't, and felt the familiar weight of the receipt in her pocket. The medicine that insurance rejected cost $340 monthly. She'd been skipping it every other month, diluting the prescription to make it last longer, a calculation that lived in her chest like a stone. Her mother, Elena, was asleep when Maya got home to their studio apartment in Washington Heights. The space was small but clean, organized with the efficiency of someone who understood that poverty required precision. Elena's hospital bed dominated one half of the room, a recent necessity after her mobility had declined. She was 53, but looked older, the cancer having carved years into her face that didn't belong there yet. Maya set the pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter, really just a hot plate and a mini-fridge in an alcove, and moved quietly to her mother's bedside. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. Maya touched her hand gently, feeling the papery quality of skin that had been through too many treatments.
On the nightstand sat a photograph in a simple frame. Maya at 17, her mother beside her, both of them smiling at the camera with an optimism that belonged to another lifetime. The photo had been taken on Maya's last day of high school, 3 weeks before her mother's diagnosis. 1 month before Maya's full scholarship to Columbia had become an impossible dream deferred indefinitely. Maya settled at the small desk wedged between the window and her fold-out cot, spreading her research materials in the small circle of lamplight. She opened her laptop, a refurbished model she'd bought 2 years ago, and logged into the trading account she'd opened 6 months earlier. The account sat there like a door she hadn't decided to walk through. $8,000. The money represented 2 years of careful saving, of taking extra shifts, of saying no to everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. She pulled up GeneMedix's investor relations page and began reading the latest clinical trial results for the 3rd time that week. The science was elegant in its simplicity, a targeted therapy that attacked cancer cells with minimal damage to healthy tissue, something that previous generations of treatments had struggled to achieve. The trial data was extraordinary, but more importantly, the market was mispricing the probability of success. Wall Street analysts, probably the same Harvard MBA as Gordon had mentioned, were assigning a 30% chance of FDA approval. Maya's analysis suggested the actual probability was closer to 75%. The difference between those two numbers, 30% and 75%, represented millions of dollars of value that would materialize the moment the market corrected its error. The question was whether it would correct before or after she made her decision. She thought about Gordon Hastings, about the casual certainty with which he dismissed an entire sector. She thought about Carlos's advice to use her knowledge for herself rather than offering it to people who couldn't hear it. She thought about her mother's medical bills, about the community college classes she'd been postponing, about the person she was supposed to become before circumstances had drafted a different story.
Maya opened her trading account and stared at the order entry screen. The cursor blinked in the quantity field, waiting for her decision. She could invest everything, $8,000, into GeneMedix stock. Or she could do what responsible people did. Keep the money in her savings account, earning its pathetic 0.5% interest, staying safe while staying still. The apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of sirens and her mother's gentle breathing. Maya's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, a 23-year-old woman in a thrift store sweatshirt, surrounded by research that no one with power would ever take seriously, standing at the edge of a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff or learning to fly. Impossible to know which until you'd already left the ground. She thought about tomorrow's shift at Bellissimo, about filling water glasses and being invisible, about overhearing conversations about millions of dollars while collecting tips in singles and fives. She thought about the look in Gordon Hastings' eyes when he'd called her sweetheart, that particular dismissal that was somehow worse than anger because it didn't even acknowledge her as opposition, just as scenery that had briefly forgotten its function. Her fingers moved to the keyboard and typed 170 shares. She hovered over the submit button, her heart pounding with the weight of everything this decision contained. This wasn't gambling. She'd done the work, understood the science, analyzed the data. But she also knew that being right didn't matter if you were wrong about being right. The market could stay irrational longer than she could stay solvent. Those 170 shares represented not just money, but time. Months of exhaustion, of choosing work over sleep, of watching opportunities pass while she stood still. Outside her window, the city hummed with its endless energy. Millions of people making millions of decisions, most of them wrong, some of them catastrophically right. Maya took a breath and clicked submit. The order processed in seconds. She now owned 170 shares of GeneMedix at $47.12 per share, plus the $6.95 trading fee. Total investment,
$8,007.35. Total remaining in her account, $14.27. She sat back, her hands shaking slightly, and looked at her mother sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. "I'm either brilliant or crazy," she whispered to the darkness. "We're going to find out which." Maya's alarm pierced the 5 a.m. darkness with its usual aggression. She silenced it quickly, careful not to wake her mother, and lay in the fold-out cot that served as her bed, staring at the ceiling where a water stain had formed a rough shape of a continent she couldn't identify. The heating pipes clanked their morning symphony, and somewhere above them, Mr. Chen was already starting his day, his footsteps a rhythmic reminder that the building was waking up, whether she was ready or not. The first thing she did, even before getting out of bed, was check her phone. GeneMedix had closed yesterday at $47.12. This morning, it opened at $46.85, down 27 cents. Maya did the mental math automatically. She was down approximately $45.90 overnight. The number sat in her stomach like bad food. She reminded herself that she'd invested for the long term, that daily fluctuations were noise, that anyone who checked their portfolio every 5 minutes was a day trader, not an investor. But the mantras felt thin against the reality of watching money disappear. She rose carefully, her body mapping the familiar soreness from yesterday's shift, the ache in her lower back from carrying trays, the tightness in her right shoulder from the repetitive motion of serving, and the specific pain in her feet that never fully went away anymore. At 23, she was too young to feel this old, but poverty aged you in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her morning routine was calibrated to the minute. She measured out her mother's medications, the morning cocktail of pills that kept pain at a manageable level, and left them on the nightstand with a glass of water and a note. "Good morning, Mommy. Pills first, then breakfast. Coffee is in the thermos. I love you, Maya." The notes varied in their details, but never in their final sentence. Elena had started saving them, keeping them in a small wooden box that once held her own mother's jewelry, back when their family had owned things worth storing carefully. Maya showered quickly in the tiny bathroom, using the cheap shampoo that smelled vaguely of artificial flowers, washing away yesterday's shift and yesterday's decision in equal measure. She dressed in the clothes she'd laid out the night before, black pants that were part of her Bellissimo uniform and a clean white shirt. Her entire wardrobe could fit in 2 garbage bags, which had been useful when they'd had to move quickly from their old apartment after the rent increase. She owned 3 pairs of shoes, work shoes, sneakers, and the heels she'd bought for job interviews she'd never gotten. In the kitchen alcove, Maya prepared breakfast for 2. Oatmeal for her mother, easy to digest, gentle on the stomach that chemo had made rebellious. Black coffee and a banana for herself because both were cheap and functional. She'd learned to think of food as fuel rather than pleasure, another small adjustment to a life of small adjustments. The grocery receipt from last week was still on the counter, and she'd annotated it in her careful handwriting, tracking expenses. $43.67 for the week. She was under budget by $2.33, which she'd already mentally allocated to the next electric bill. While the oatmeal cooled, Maya opened her laptop and began her other morning routine, the one that mattered more than breakfast. She checked pre-market trading data, read overnight news from pharmaceutical industry publications, and reviewed analyst reports that she accessed through a free trial account she'd carefully managed to extend for 3 months. She had a system of rotating free trials across different financial research platforms, always remembering to cancel before they converted to paid subscriptions she couldn't afford.
GeneMedix had released no new information overnight. The stock price fluctuation was just market noise, the random movement of supply and demand finding its daily equilibrium. Maya read through a bearish analyst report from Goldman Sachs, the author arguing that biotech valuations remained inflated despite sector corrections. The report's author was someone named Derek Williamson, whose track record she'd investigated months ago. He'd been wrong about biotech more often than he'd been right, but his errors were always in the direction of excessive caution, which Wall Street apparently rewarded as prudence. She made notes in her research journal, a spiral notebook she'd bought at a dollar store, its pages now dense with charts and calculations in her small, precise handwriting. The journal was organized by company, with GeneMedix taking up the first 40 pages. She'd tracked everything: FDA advisory committee composition, patent expirations for competing drugs, insurance reimbursement data, even the professional backgrounds of the company's senior management. She knew that the chief medical officer had previously worked at Bristol-Myers Squibb and had successfully brought 3 cancer drugs to market. She knew that their manufacturing facility in Ireland had passed its last 2 FDA inspections without major violations. She knew things that Derek Williamson probably had subordinates to know for him. Her mother stirred as Maya was closing her laptop. Elena opened her eyes slowly, the way she did everything now, as if motion itself cost more than it used to. "Mija," she said, her voice rough with sleep and medication. "You're here." "I'm always here, Mummy," Maya said, bringing over the oatmeal and the morning pills. She helped her mother sit up, adjusting the hospital bed to the right angle, arranging the pillows that made everything slightly more bearable. "How are you feeling?" "Like $1 million," which was their joke, the thing she said every morning no matter how she actually felt. Then, more honestly, "The pain is manageable today. That's enough." Maya watched her mother take the pills one by one, washing them down with careful sips of water. Elena had been a kindergarten teacher before the cancer, the kind who decorated her classroom with bright colors and kept a drawer full of Band-Aids and encouraging stickers. She loved her students with a fierceness that Maya had inherited and redirected toward the stock market, toward data and research, toward finding patterns in numbers the way her mother had found potential in 5-year-olds. "You were up late again," Elena said, not quite a question. "Just reviewing some research," Maya replied, keeping her voice casual. She hadn't told her mother about investing the savings. How could she explain putting $8,000 into a stock when that money represented security, safety, the buffer between them and catastrophe? "Maya, you worry about you. You work so hard, you sleep so little. You're 23. I should be taking care of you," Maya interrupted gently. "That's exactly where I should be." They'd had this conversation in various forms for 3 years, ever since Maya had deferred her Columbia scholarship to become her mother's caregiver. Elena always protested that she'd ruined her daughter's life, and Maya always insisted that she'd chosen this, that family wasn't ruin, that education could wait, but your mother couldn't. Both positions contained truth and denial in equal measure, and they'd learned to navigate around the parts that hurt too much to examine directly. Maya helped her mother with breakfast, told her about a customer at Bellissimo who ordered the same appetizer 3 times because he was too embarrassed to admit he couldn't pronounce bruschetta, made her laugh with an impression of Carlos correcting a new server's wine pour technique. These morning conversations were their normal, the island of peace before Maya left for the day and Elena faced the long hours alone with daytime television and pain that medicine only partially masked. At 7:30, Maya gathered her things, her work bag with a change of clothes, her phone charger, the book she was theoretically reading on the subway, though she usually ended up reading financial news instead. She'd learned to carry everything she might need for the day, because coming home between shifts wasted time and subway fares they couldn't spare. "I love you, Mommy," she said, kissing her mother's forehead. "Your lunch is in the fridge, the green container. Don't forget to take your afternoon pills at 2. I'll call during my break." "I love you more," she replied, which was the other part of their routine. "Be careful out there." The subway was crowded with the particular density of rush hour, bodies pressed together in forced intimacy, everyone carefully avoiding eye contact while simultaneously invading each other's space. Maya found a spot near the door and pulled out her phone,
refreshing her trading app even though the market wouldn't open for another 90 minutes. GeneMedix was still at 46.85 in pre-market trading. She forced herself to close the app and open her Kindle instead. A used one she'd bought at a pawn shop, loaded with free public domain books and investment classics she'd pirated from file-sharing sites with only mild guilt.
She was reading The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham for the third time, highlighting passages that felt relevant to her situation. The investor's chief problem, and even his worst enemy, is likely to be himself, Graham wrote, and Maya felt the words like an accusation. Was she being an intelligent investor or a fool in disguise? The line between confidence and delusion was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and she was walking it with $8,000 she couldn't afford to lose. The subway lurched through the darkness, and Maya looked at her reflection in the window. A young woman in work clothes, surrounded by people heading to jobs they probably hated, all of them trapped in the machine of making rent and making do. She wondered if Gordon Hastings had ever taken the subway, if he had any idea what it felt like to calculate the cost-benefit of a $2.75 fare versus the exhaustion of walking 30 blocks. Probably not. People like Gordon had been born into a different world, one where risk meant a slightly smaller bonus, not a choice between medication and groceries. She arrived at Bellissimo at 8:45, 15 minutes early as always. The restaurant in the morning was a different creature than at night. Lights bright and unforgiving, staff moving with purpose rather than performance, the smell of bleach and lemon replacing wine and reduction sauces. Maya changed into her uniform in the staff bathroom, pinning her name tag carefully, checking her appearance in the mirror. She'd learned to make herself presentable on almost no money. Hair pulled back neatly, minimal makeup purchased at drugstores, clothes that were cheap but clean and pressed. "Morning, Maya," said Jennifer, the morning manager, a woman in her 40s who'd worked her way up from hostess and carried the weariness of someone who'd fought for every small promotion. "I'm putting you on lunch service today. Then you're off until dinner shift starts at 5. That work?" "Perfect," Maya said, though it meant a 4-hour gap with nowhere to go and no money to spend filling it. She'd probably find a library or a coffee shop where you could sit for hours over a single cup, one of the many invisible strategies poor people use to exist in cities built for the wealthy. The lunch shift at Bellissimo was different from dinner. Faster, less formal, populated by business lunches and tourists who'd read about the restaurant in guidebooks. Maya moved through her section with practiced efficiency, taking orders, making recommendations, smiling at jokes that weren't funny, refilling water glasses before they were empty. The work required complete attention while being completely mindless, a strange state of flow where her muscle memory took over and her mind was free to wander. Between tables, she checked her phone in the service station. The market had opened. GeneMedix was trading at $47.03, up 18 cents from the morning. Maya was now down approximately $15.30 on her investment, a microscopic improvement that her heart celebrated entirely out of proportion to its significance. She refreshed the page twice more before Carlos appeared beside her. "You're going to wear out your screen," he said, his tone more observation than judgment. "Just checking something," Maya replied, slipping the phone into her apron pocket. Carlos studied her with the particular attention of someone who'd known enough young people to recognize when they were heading for trouble. "You invested in something," he said, not quite a question. Maya hesitated, then nodded. There was no point lying to Carlos. He saw everything anyway. "A biotech stock, the one I tried to tell that customer about last night. The one who called you sweetheart and ordered dessert? That one." Carlos sighed, the sound containing years of watching smart people make gambles they couldn't afford. "Maya, please tell me you didn't invest money you need for your mother." "I didn't," she said quickly. "This was separate. Savings. Money I'd been putting aside." "Money you were saving for school?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Carlos shook his head but didn't lecture, which somehow made it worse. "You're brilliant, mija. But brilliance without capital is just frustration. The market doesn't care how smart you are or how much research you've done. It cares about who has the most money to wait out being wrong." "I'm not wrong," she said with more confidence than she felt. Maybe not, but being right at the wrong time is the same as being wrong, Carlos replied. Then, more gently, I know you want to prove something. To yourself, to customers like that man last night, to everyone who's ever dismissed you because of your uniform or your zip code or your age. But you don't have the margin for error that rich people have. When they lose money, they lose a vacation house. When you lose money, you lose everything. Maya nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words, even as she rejected their conclusion. I have to try, Carlos. If I don't try, I'm just accepting that this, she gestured around the restaurant, at the uniform, at the life she was living, is all I get. That I spend the rest of my life being invisible while serving people who wouldn't notice if I disappeared.
There's nothing wrong with this work, Carlos said, his voice firm. I've raised 3 kids on this work, sent 2 to college on this work. This work has dignity if you choose to see it that way. You're right, Maya said, meaning it. But you also told your kids to do something else, didn't you? You didn't raise them to wait tables. Carlos smiled sadly. I raised them to have choices I didn't have. That's what parents do. He paused. Your mother would say the same thing. My mother would tell me to be careful, to be safe, to not take risks we can't afford. And she'd be right, and I'd still do this anyway because staying safe hasn't gotten us anywhere except further behind. Maya felt tears threatening and forced them back. I'm tired of being careful, Carlos. Careful means we lose slowly instead of all at once. Before Carlos could respond, Jennifer appeared from the kitchen. Table 8 needs attention, they're ready to order, and Table 12 has questions about the wine list. Maya straightened her uniform, assembled her smile, and returned to being invisible. Table 8 was a group of lawyers celebrating something, their conversation full of billable hours and partnership tracks. Table 12 was a couple, wealthy, older, their easy affection for each other making Maya ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She took their orders, made suggestions, performed the choreography of service with the part of her mind that had learned to do this without thinking. The other part of her mind was calculating. GeneMedix's Q2 earnings call was scheduled for next month. The FDA Advisory Committee meeting for their lead drug was in 6 weeks. There were at least 4 separate catalysts that could move the stock price before the end of the quarter. She'd done the research, understood the science, analyzed the data. She wasn't gambling, she was investing in information asymmetry, betting that she knew something the market hadn't priced in yet. But there was a whisper in the back of her mind, getting louder. What if she was wrong? What if the Harvard MBAs who advised Gordon Hastings knew something she'd missed? What if her analysis was flawed by her desperate need for it to be right? What if she'd just taken her mother's safety net and set it on fire because her pride couldn't accept being dismissed as sweetheart? At 2 p.m., during her break, Maya called her mother from the alley behind the restaurant. The alley smelled like garbage and possibility, the particular urban mixture that she'd stopped noticing. How are you feeling, Mommy? Good, mija. I had my lunch, took my pills. I'm watching that cooking show I like, the one with the British people who are very concerned about soggy bottoms. Elena laughed, the sound slightly breathless but genuine. How's work? Same as always, busy lunch rush, demanding customers, Carlos being Carlos. I paused. The words I wanted to say were stuck somewhere between my heart and my mouth. I wanted to tell my mother about the investment, about the risk I'd taken, about the hope that maybe, just maybe they could claw their way towards something better. But I couldn't add that weight to a body already carrying so much. You sound tired, baby, Elena said. I'm fine, just a long day. I have a break until dinner shift, so I'm going to the library for a bit. Always studying, Elena said, pride and sadness mixing in her voice. My smart girl. I love you, Mommy. I love you more. Be careful. Maya ended the call and stood in the alley for a moment, letting the March wind cut through her thin jacket.
She checked her phone again. GeneMedix, $47.21. She was now down approximately $4.90 on her investment. The number was so small as to be almost meaningless, but Maya felt a tiny flutter of hope anyway. The trend was positive. Maybe the market was starting to see what she had seen. Maybe her research was right. Maybe being a waitress with a spiral notebook full of data was enough. Her aching feet, her empty stomach, her mother's illness, the $8,000 she'd invested, and the life she was supposed to be living. At 4:45, she packed up and headed back to Bellissimo for the dinner shift. The evening crowd was different, older, wealthier, more demanding. These were people for whom dining at Bellissimo was routine rather than occasion, who knew exactly how they wanted their meals prepared and didn't hesitate to send things back if they fell short of expectation. Maya was assigned to Section 3, which included Table 17. She felt a small spike of something, anticipation, dread, when she saw the reservation book. Gordon Hastings III, Party of 4, 7:30 p.m. reservation. The universe, apparently, had a sense of humor. He arrived exactly on time, because people like Gordon were always exactly on time, trailed by 3 other men in suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Maya approached the table with her notepad and her practiced smile, wondering if he'd recognize her from last night. He didn't. Of course he didn't. Servers were interchangeable to people like Gordon, part of the restaurant's furniture. "Good evening, gentlemen," Maya said. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Gordon barely glanced at her, his attention on the man to his right. "Scotch, neat, Macallan 18. The others ordered similarly, their drink choices signaling status and taste in the way that wealthy men seem to need their beverages to do. Maya brought the drinks and took their dinner orders, her movements automatic, her mind cataloging information even as her mouth said the things it was supposed to say. Gordon and his companions were discussing market movements, portfolio adjustments, the particular concerns of people trying to protect wealth rather than build it. "The biotech sector is still overvalued," Gordon was saying, and Maya felt a jolt of attention snap through her. "I've been shorting GeneMedix, easy money. Their lead drug is going to fail the FDA panel. Too many side effects, insufficient long-term data. The stock is going to crater when the panel releases their recommendation." Maya's hand trembled slightly as she refilled water glasses. Gordon was shorting GeneMedix. He'd bet money that the stock would go down, which meant his profit came from her loss. They were on opposite sides of the same trade, and only one of them could be right. "Are you confident in that position?" one of the other men asked. "Completely. I have inside information. Well, not inside exactly, but close enough. Someone on the advisory panel owes me a favor, gave me a sense of how the vote is going to go. Negative recommendation is almost certain." Gordon smiled, the expression containing the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd found an edge. "GeneMedix will be under $30 by June. Easiest short I've made all year." Maya's mind raced. Was Gordon actually sitting on material non-public information? That was illegal, securities fraud, the kind of thing that got people prosecuted. But more likely he was exaggerating his position for the benefit of his companions, maybe interpreting some ambiguous conversation as insider knowledge because it confirmed his bias. Either way, he was wrong about the FDA panel. Maya had read the preliminary data, understood the secondary endpoints, knew that the advisory committee's concerns had been addressed in the supplemental filing. She wanted to say something, to warn him, to explain why he was about to lose money. But she'd learned her lesson from last night. Gordon Hastings didn't want her advice. He wanted his scotch refilled and his steak cooked medium rare, and his worldview confirmed by people who understood that their agreement was more valuable than their insight. So Maya said nothing. She brought their appetizers and their entrees, refilled their drinks, cleared their plates, performed her role with the precision that 3 years of practice had perfected. And while she moved through the choreography of service, a different calculation was running in her mind. If Gordon was shorting GeneMedix, he'd borrowed shares and sold them, betting he could buy them back at a lower price. When the stock went up instead of down,
He'd be forced to cover his position at a loss, and if the FDA news was positive, when it was positive, Maya corrected herself, the stock could spike dramatically, turning Gordon's easy money into a catastrophic loss. The irony sat in her chest like a stone. The man who dismissed her advice yesterday was making the exact mistake she had tried to warn him about, and she was going to profit from his arrogance while he suffered for it. She should have felt vindicated, triumphant even, but instead she felt something more complicated, a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, the weird discomfort of watching someone walk confidently towards a cliff they couldn't see.
"Excuse me, miss," Gordon said, snapping his fingers to get her attention. "We're ready for the check." Maya brought the bill, $847.63 for 4 people, more money than she made in a week. Gordon paid without looking at the total, added a 15% tip, adequate but not generous, and stood to leave. As he walked past her toward the exit, Maya allowed herself one moment of silent rebellion. "Good luck with your short position," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. He paused, turned back to her with mild confusion. "What?" "GeneMedix. I hope your short position works out for you." She kept her voice neutral, professional, but her eyes held his just long enough to make clear that she'd heard every word, understood every implication. Gordon's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, irritation, something that might have been embarrassment if he'd been capable of it. "You were listening to a private conversation." "I was doing my job, which involves being in proximity to your table while you discussed your trades loudly enough for the entire section to hear. But you're right, I should have been more invisible. I apologize." She walked away before he could respond, her heart hammering with the recklessness of what she'd just done. Carlos was watching from the service station, his expression somewhere between alarm and admiration. "That was either very brave or very stupid," he said quietly. "Probably both," Maya admitted, "but I'm tired of pretending I don't exist." The rest of the shift passed without incident. Gordon and his party left, probably to some bar where they'd continue discussing their portfolios and their certainties. Maya finished her work at 11 p.m., changed out of her uniform, collected her tips, $183 for the night, good by her standards, though it represented hours of smiling and performing and being pleasant to people who barely registered her existence. The subway ride home was quieter than the morning, filled with night shift workers and people returning from second jobs, and others whose reasons for being on the train at midnight were their own business. Maya checked her phone one final time. GeneMedix had closed at $47.35. She was now down approximately $2.90 on her investment, close enough to breaking even that she could almost pretend she hadn't risked everything. She got home at 11:47 p.m. Her mother was asleep, her breathing soft and steady in the dark apartment. Maya changed into pajamas, unfolded her cot, and lay down in the darkness. Her body ached with the familiar exhaustion of a double shift, but her mind was racing with calculations and possibilities and the strange emotional cocktail of hope and terror that came from having made a bet she couldn't take back. She thought about Gordon Hastings, comfortable in whatever expensive apartment or house he lived in, probably not thinking about GeneMedix or the short position that he believed was easy money. She thought about the distance between their lives, the unimaginable gulf between someone who could casually invest millions and someone who'd invested everything. She thought about what it meant to be right when no one with power would listen, to understand something important while wearing a uniform that made you invisible. Tomorrow she'd wake up at 5 a.m. and do it all again. The alarm would ring, her mother would need her medication, the subway would be crowded, Bellissimo would serve its expensive meals to people who could afford them. And Maya would move between the tables collecting information and tips in equal measure. The routine was crushing and comforting at once, the shape of a life that wasn't the one she'd planned, but was the one she was living anyway. But now there was something else, 170 shares of GeneMedix, a bet against comfortable certainty, a small rebellion against the idea that people like her should stay in their place and be grateful for it. The investment sat in her account like a promise or a threat, impossible to know which until time revealed the answer. Maya closed her eyes and tried to sleep,
but her mind kept returning to numbers. $47.35 per share, down $2.90 total. The FDA Advisory Committee meeting in 6 weeks, Q2 earnings next month, the slow accumulation of time and data that would eventually prove her right or destroy her in the process. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer to the universe or mathematics or whatever force governed the intersection of research and luck. Please let me be right. Please let the work matter. Please let me be more than invisible. The city hummed outside her window, indifferent and eternal, full of people making bets they couldn't afford and dreams they couldn't achieve, and the small defiant acts that kept them going anyway. Maya fell asleep somewhere after midnight, her phone alarm already set for 5 a.m., her life continuing its familiar pattern even as she'd planted a small bomb in the foundation, waiting to see if it would explode or bloom.
Forward, marked by the daily movement of stock prices and the slow accumulation of news that either validated or threatened everything she'd bet on. GeneMedix traded sideways for the first week, hovering between $46 and $48 per share, the stock price moving in the narrow band of uncertainty that preceded major catalysts. Maya checked it compulsively before getting out of bed, during subway rides, in the restaurant bathroom between tables, before sleep. Each refresh of her trading app was a small prayer answered or denied, and the emotional weight of those micro-movements surprised her with their intensity. "You're going to drive yourself crazy," Carlos told her one afternoon in the service station, watching her check her phone for the dozenth time that shift. "The price is going to be what it's going to be whether you look at it every 5 minutes or not." "I know," Maya said, but she checked it again anyway. $47.62. Down $13.60 total on her investment. The number was small enough that she could almost pretend it didn't matter, large enough that her stomach tightened every time she saw it. The first real news came 3 weeks after her investment, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Maya was on the subway reading financial news when her phone buzzed with an alert from her investment app. GeneMedix announces positive interim results from Phase 3 trial expansion cohort. Stock up 8% in pre-market trading. Her heart seized. She clicked through to the press release, reading quickly, her hands shaking slightly. The trial expansion cohort, patients who'd been added to the study after the initial enrollment, showed even better results than the primary cohort. Response rates were higher, side effects were lower, and most importantly, the data addressed the exact concerns that had been flagged in the FDA's preliminary review. Maya did the math automatically. 8% of $47.62 meant the stock would open around $51.43. Her investment would be worth approximately $8,743, a gain of $735.65. She'd made more in overnight market movements than she'd made in tips last week. The realization was dizzying. The subway car suddenly felt too small, too close, the other commuters pressing in with their morning exhaustion and their coffee cups and their own small tragedies. Maya wanted to scream or laugh or do something to release the pressure building in her chest. Instead, she sat very still and watched the number on her screen as pre-market trading continued. $51.50, $51.89, $52.15. Each uptick felt like vindication and terror in equal measure. She called her mother during her break, needing to tell someone, unable to keep the news contained. "Mommy, remember that research I've been doing? The biotech company?" Maya's words tumbled out fast, excited. "Their trial results came out this morning. The data is even better than expected." "That's wonderful, Mija," Elena said, genuine warmth in her voice. "Your research was right?" "So far, yes, but there's still the FDA approval process," and she stopped herself, recognizing that she was about to explain the nuances of regulatory pathways to her mother, who was probably in pain and didn't need a lesson in pharmaceutical economics.
It's good news, really good news. I'm proud of you, Mija. You work so hard studying these things. Maybe one day you'll get to use all this knowledge in a real career, not just for research. The words stung in a way her mother didn't intend. Maya wanted to explain that this wasn't just research anymore, that she'd invested their savings, that she'd taken a risk that could change their lives or destroy them. But the weight of that confession felt too heavy for a phone call during a lunch break, so she deflected. Maybe someday. I have to get back to work. I love you. I love you more. Be careful. At Bellissimo that evening, Maya moved through her shift with a distraction she struggled to hide. Her mind kept calculating. $52.15 per share times 170 shares equals $8,865.50 minus the original $8,007.35 equals $858.15 in profit. She'd made $858.15 in 3 weeks for doing nothing except being right. The amount was surreal, impossible. It was almost 2 months of rent. It was her mother's expensive medication for 2.5 months. It was the textbooks for an entire semester of community college classes. But it wasn't realized yet. The paper gains only existed on her phone screen, a theoretical number that could evaporate with the next piece of bad news or market correction. Maya had learned enough to know that paper gains weren't real until you sold, and she had no intention of selling yet. The FDA Advisory Committee meeting was still 3 weeks away, and that's when the real catalyst would hit. "You're smiling at your phone," Jennifer observed, passing by with a stack of menus. "Good news?" "Just a good day," Maya replied, slipping her phone into her apron pocket. "We'll channel that energy to table 15. They've been waiting for their drinks for 10 minutes.
Maya brought the drinks, took the orders, performed her role. But part of her mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios and timelines, calculating probabilities and potential outcomes. Gordon Hastings' short position would be underwater now, losing money with every dollar the stock climbed. She wondered if he was worried yet, if his confidence had started to crack, or if people like him never worried because they had enough money to outlast their mistakes. The answer came 2 nights later. Gordon returned to Bellissimo with the same 3 companions as before, their table conversation loud enough that Maya could hear it from the service station. She wasn't assigned to their section. Carlos had taken table 17, perhaps deliberately giving her distance from the man who dismissed her. But Maya could still hear Gordon's voice carrying across the dining room. "It's a temporary spike," he was saying, with the forced certainty of someone trying to convince himself. "The market is overreacting to preliminary data. The FDA panel will see through the cherry-picked results. My short position is fine. I'm actually adding to it." Maya felt a cold spike of concern that surprised her. Gordon was doubling down, increasing his bet against GeneMedix, even as the evidence accumulated against his position. It was a classic mistake, letting ego drive investment decisions, refusing to admit error because the cost of being wrong felt worse than the cost of losing money. She caught Carlos's eye across the dining room, and he gave her a subtle shake of his head. "Don't engage. Stay invisible. Let the man make his mistakes in peace." Maya obeyed, but the interaction sat uneasily in her chest. She'd spent 3 years serving wealthy people who made careless decisions, but this felt different. Gordon wasn't just wrong. He was actively, catastrophically wrong, and his certainty was going to cost him a fortune. Part of her felt satisfied by this, vindicated by watching the man who'd called her sweetheart walk into disaster. But another part of her, the part that had spent hours researching, that understood the complexity of these decisions, felt something closer to pity. The 3rd week brought more news. GeneMedix announced that the FDA had accepted their supplemental filing addressing the agency's concerns about long-term safety data. The stock jumped another 6%, closing at $55.28. Maya's investment was now worth $9,397.60, a gain of $1,390.25. She stared at the number on her screen during her subway commute home, the fluorescent lights of the train flickering overhead, the other passengers slumped in their exhaustion. $1,300. She'd made $1,300 in less than a month. The amount represented weeks of work at Bellissimo, months of careful budgeting, years of the small calculations that structured her life. And she'd made it by being right about something, by doing research that no one else had valued until the market proved it true. She wanted to tell someone, to share this validation with another human being who could appreciate what it meant. But who could she tell? Her mother would worry about the risk. Carlos would warn her about volatility. She had no friends outside of work. Poverty had taught her that friendships required time and money she couldn't spare, that invitations to dinner or movies were landmines of expense she had to navigate around until people stopped asking. So she sat alone on the subway with her secret prophet, watching the stations pass, feeling simultaneously powerful and isolated, successful and fraudulent, right and terrified that being right once didn't mean she'd be right again. At home, she found her mother awake in bed, reading a mystery novel from the library's large print collection. Elena looked up as Maya entered, and something in her daughter's expression made her set the book aside. "What's wrong, mija?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine." Maya set down her bag, began the evening routine of checking her mother's medications, preparing them for the next day. "Maya Sofia Rodriguez," Elena said, using the full name that meant she saw through the deflection. "You forget that I know your face better than my own. Something is bothering you." Maya sat on the edge of her mother's hospital bed, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. The words came out before she could stop them. "Mummy, I invested our savings. The $8,000 I'd been saving for school, I put it all in that biotech stock I've been researching." She expected anger, disappointment, fear. Instead, Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face with the particular attention of someone who'd learned to read subtitles beneath words. "And," Elena finally said, "and the stock went up. I've made almost $1,400 in 3 weeks. That's good, yes? So why do you look like you're about to cry?" Maya felt the tears come then, surprising both of them. "Because I don't know if I'm smart or just lucky. Because if I'm wrong, we lose everything. Because I took money we couldn't afford to risk and I did it anyway. And maybe that makes me reckless, or maybe it makes me brave, and I can't tell the difference anymore." Elena reached for her daughter's hand, her grip weaker than it used to be, but still firm. "Mija, listen to me. You are the smartest person I know. You've been studying these things for years, not because anyone told you to, not because you were in school, but because you love understanding how things work. You did research. You made an informed decision. That's not gambling. That's using your mind. But what if I'm wrong? Then we lose $8,000 and we figure it out, the same way we figured out everything else. Maya, we were poor before this investment, and will be poor after it if things go badly. But maybe you found a way for us to be less poor. Maybe you found a way to get back to school, to have the life you should have had before I got sick." "This isn't about you getting sick, Mommy." "Yes, it is," Elena interrupted gently. "It's about both of us losing the futures we planned, but maybe you found a way to get yours back. I'm not angry, mija. I'm proud of you for taking a chance." Maya wiped her tears, feeling something loosen in her chest.
I should have told you before I did it. Yes, you should have. But I understand why you didn't. You were protecting me from worry, the same way I try to protect you from how much pain I'm in most days. We're both very good at carrying weight alone. Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. But we don't have to. Not always. That night, Maya slept better than she had in weeks, the confession having lifted a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. When her alarm went off at 5 a.m., she felt almost rested, almost hopeful, almost like someone whose decisions might actually work out. The fourth week brought turbulence. A competing pharmaceutical company announced unexpected positive results for their own leukemia treatment, sparking analysts' concerns about market competition. GeneMedix stock dropped 9% in a single day, falling to $50.31. Maya watched her paper profits evaporate from $1,390 to just $389 in 6 hours of trading. The volatility was nauseating. She spent her lunch break in the Bellissimo bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet seat in a locked stall, watching the ticker move on her phone and fighting waves of panic. Had she been wrong? Was the market correcting her hubris? Should she sell now, take the small profit and walk away before it disappeared entirely? But when she forced herself to read the actual news, not just the headline, but the details, her panic eased slightly. The competing treatment had shown good results, yes, but it was earlier in development, still in phase 2 trials, at least 2 years behind GeneMedix's timeline. The market was overreacting to phantom competition that wouldn't materialize for years. This was noise, not signal. She closed her trading app and made herself wait. She'd done the research, she understood the science. One day of volatility didn't change the fundamental thesis. She just had to have the discipline to stick with her analysis instead of panicking at the first sign of turbulence. But discipline was harder when you were betting money you couldn't afford to lose. That evening at Bellissimo, she served a table of young venture capitalists, probably her age or younger, dressed in the carefully casual, expensive clothes that signaled tech money rather than finance money. They were talking about their latest investments with the breezy confidence of people playing with other people's capital. I'm not worried about short-term volatility. Our fund has a 10-year horizon. We can afford to ride out the noise. She wanted to laugh or scream or both. Of course they could afford to ride out the noise. They had a 10-year horizon because they had the capital to wait that long. When you were poor, your time horizon compressed to weeks or months, not years. You couldn't afford to be patient because rent came due every month, and medication couldn't be delayed, and life kept demanding payment regardless of your investment strategy. She brought their food, collected their plates, accepted their adequate tip with her practiced smile. After they left, she found Carlos in the service station, looking at her with the knowing expression of someone who'd lived enough life to recognize when someone else was struggling. "Talk to me, Chia." Maya told him about the stock drop, about watching her profits evaporate, about the competing treatment announcement, and her analysis of why it didn't matter. Carlos listened without interrupting, his weathered hands moving automatically through the ritual of polishing wine glasses. "You know what the difference is between you and those kids at table 8? Carlos finally said. "They can afford to be wrong. You can't. That's not fair, but it's true. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are you confident enough in your research to bet everything on it?"
"I already bet everything on it," Maya replied. "No, you bet $8,000, but you haven't bet your sanity yet, your sleep, your ability to function at this job. Right now, you can still walk away with a small profit or a small loss. But if you keep going, if you hold through the FDA meeting, if you wait for approval or rejection, then you're betting everything. Your peace of mind, your mother's medication money, your future. Make sure you're ready for that bet before the stakes get higher." Maya nodded slowly, understanding what Carlos was really saying. It wasn't too late to back out. She could sell tomorrow, take her $389 profit, return most of the money to savings, and go back to the safe poverty she understood. Or she could hold, trusting her research, believing that she'd seen something real beneath the market's noise. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly. "I think I have to be." "Then I hope you're right, mija. For both our sakes. I like having you around here, and if this goes badly, you're going to be impossible to work with." Maya smiled, despite herself. "If this goes badly, I'll be too broke to afford the subway to get here anyway." The 5th week brought the moment she'd been simultaneously anticipating and dreading. GeneMedix announced the date of the FDA Advisory Committee meeting, April 24th, exactly 13 days away. The stock jumped 7% on the news, climbing to $53.84. Maya's investment was now worth $9,152.80, a profit of $1,145.45. But more importantly, the clock was now ticking. In 13 days, a panel of experts would review GeneMedix's data and issue a recommendation on whether the FDA should approve their treatment. A positive recommendation would send the stock soaring, probably to $80 or above based on comparable approvals. A negative recommendation would crater it, potentially below $30, exactly as Gordon Hastings had predicted. Maya had 13 days to either be proven spectacularly right or catastrophically wrong. She spent those days in a state of controlled anxiety, functioning normally on the surface, while her mind ran constant calculations underneath. She read every piece of analysis she could find about FDA Advisory Committee patterns, voting records of individual panel members, historical approval rates for similar drugs. She built more spreadsheets, refined her probability estimates, checked and rechecked her assumptions. The work was consuming and necessary, a way of imposing order on uncertainty, of feeling like she had some control over an outcome that was ultimately beyond her influence. She couldn't affect what the FDA panel decided. She could only try to predict it accurately. At Bellissimo, Gordon Hastings continued his regular appearances, his confidence seemingly unshaken despite the stock's upward movement. Maya watched him from a distance, fascinated and disturbed by his ability to maintain certainty in the face of contradicting evidence. He was still shorting GeneMedix, still telling his companions that the FDA panel would reject the treatment, still believing that his inside information, whatever that actually meant, would prove accurate. One evening, 6 days before the FDA meeting, Maya found herself assigned to table 17. Gordon was there with 2 different companions this time. Their conversation focused on portfolio rebalancing and market hedges. She approached with her notepad, her professional smile in place. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you with drinks?" Gordon glanced up, and for the first time there was a flicker of recognition. "You're the girl who warned me about my short position, the one who thinks she knows more than my analysts." "I'm just your server," Maya said evenly. "Would you like your usual Macallan 18? "My usual. And an apology would be nice. Your unsolicited advice cost me a moment of doubt that I didn't need." Maya felt anger flash through her, hot and sudden. "I apologize for speaking out of turn. It won't happen again." She turned to walk away, but Gordon's voice stopped her. "You actually invested in GeneMedix, didn't you? That's why you warned me. You bought the stock, and now you're praying the FDA approves it." Maya turned back, her professional mask slipping slightly. "I did my research and made an informed investment decision, which is different from shorting a stock based on vague claims of inside information while ignoring publicly available clinical trial data that contradicts your thesis." "No, sir," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. "A waitress who's done more research on this stock than you apparently have is simply noting that your position is based on ego rather than analysis. But you're absolutely right. What could I possibly know? I just carry water and read FDA briefing documents in my spare time. Please enjoy your drinks." She walked away before anyone could respond, her heart hammering, her hands shaking with adrenaline and the recklessness of what she'd just done. Carlos intercepted her at the service station, his expression somewhere between alarm and pride. "That was either the bravest thing or the stupidest thing I've ever seen you do," he said quietly. "Probably both," Maya replied, echoing their conversation from weeks ago. "But I'm so tired of being invisible." "You better hope you're right about that stock," Carlos said, "because if you're wrong, he's never going to let you forget it. If I'm wrong, I'll have bigger problems than Gordon Hastings' opinion of me." The remaining days before the FDA meeting crawled by with agonizing slowness. Maya's sleep deteriorated, her nights filled with anxiety dreams about stock tickers and FDA panels, and her mother's disappointed face. She checked her phone constantly, reading news that wasn't there yet, waiting for information that wouldn't arrive until the meeting itself. 3 days before the meeting, GeneMedix stock hit $56.42. 2 days before, it pulled back to $54.31 on general market weakness. The day before, it jumped to $58.17 on speculation that the panel vote would be positive. Maya's investment swung between $9,000 and $9,889 like a pendulum, marking time until the moment of truth. The night before the FDA meeting, Maya couldn't sleep at all. She lay in her fold-out cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to her mother's breathing, thinking about everything that would happen tomorrow. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and made coffee, sitting at her small desk with her research spread around her like a fortress of data. She reviewed everything one final time. The clinical trial results, excellent. The safety profile, acceptable. The unmet medical need, significant. The composition of the advisory panel, experienced, evidence-based, historically favorable to innovative cancer treatments. The political environment at the FDA, moderately supportive of new approvals. The probability of a positive recommendation, 73% by her calculation. But probability wasn't certainty. A 73% chance of success meant a 27% chance of failure. She'd invested everything on what was essentially a coin weighted in her favor, but still capable of landing on the wrong side. At 4 a.m., her mother awoke, aware of Maya's presence at the desk. "Mija, you should sleep." "I can't. The FDA meeting is today. By tonight, we'll know if I was right or if I just threw away our savings on arrogance and numbers that don't mean what I thought they meant." Elena eased herself up in bed, wincing slightly at the movement. "Come here." Maya crossed to her mother's bedside, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. Elena took her hand. "Whatever happens today, I'm proud of you. You saw something that other people missed. You did the work. You made a choice. That takes courage, mija. Win or lose, you have courage." "Courage without success is just failure with good intentions," Maya said quietly. "No," Elena said firmly. "Courage without success is still courage. Trying and failing is not the same as never trying. You've already won something by refusing to be invisible. The money, that's just money. But you proved to yourself that you're more than your uniform. That's worth more than any stock price." Maya felt tears on her cheeks. "I really want to be right, though, Mommy. Not just for the money. I want to be right because it means all the studying mattered, all the research meant something, all the nights staying up late were worth it. I want to be right because it proves that working hard and being smart actually counts for something, that the game isn't completely rigged against people like us." "I know, baby. I know." Elena pulled her daughter close, holding her the way she used to when Maya was small and the world seemed too big and frightening. "But whatever happens today, I'm proud of you. I know you worked very hard on this, and whatever the outcome, it's enough for me. I'm always proud of you." They sat together in the pre-dawn darkness, mother and daughter, neither one of them able to sleep, both of them waiting for the sunrise that would bring the answer to a question that had consumed the last 6 weeks of their lives. At 5 a.m., Maya's alarm went off, unnecessary since she was already awake. She silenced it and began her morning routine, moving through the familiar patterns while her mind remained fixated on what would happen today. The FDA Advisory Committee would convene at 9 a.m. The voting would likely occur in the afternoon. The market would react in real time to the news. By tonight, Maya would either be vindicated or devastated. By tonight, Gordon Hastings would either be gloating or ruined. By tonight, everything would have changed, or nothing would have mattered. She got dressed,
prepared her mother's medications, made coffee that tasted like anxiety. At 7 a.m., she texted Jennifer at Bellissimo. "Family emergency. Can't work today. I'm so sorry." It was the first shift she'd missed in 3 years, and the lie felt both necessary and terrible. Jennifer's response came quickly. "Is your mother okay?" "She's fine. I just need to handle something important. I'll be there tomorrow." Maya spent the morning pacing their small apartment, her laptop open to a financial news site providing live updates from the FDA meeting. The opening statements began at 9 a.m. The company presentation started at 9:30. Panel member questions stretched through the late morning and into early afternoon. Her mother watched from her hospital bed, unable to help but offering silent support. At 2:30 p.m., the panel convened for their vote. Maya stood in the middle of their studio apartment, phone in one hand, laptop open on her desk, barely breathing as she waited for the news to break. At 2:47 p.m., the notification appeared on her screen. FDA Advisory Panel votes 12-1 to recommend approval for GeneMedix leukemia treatment. Maya stared at the words, reading them 3 times to make sure they were real. Then she looked at her trading app. GeneMedix stock was halted. Too much volume, too much volatility, the market unable to process the news fast enough. When trading resumed 5 minutes later, the stock jumped to $89.23 in seconds. She owned 170 shares at $89.23 per share. Her investment was worth $15,169.10. She'd made $7,161.75 in profit, nearly as much as her original investment. She'd almost doubled her money in 6 weeks by being right about something when everyone with power had been wrong. Maya sat down hard on her fold-out cot. The numbers not quite real yet, the victory not quite processed. Her mother was saying something, congratulations, celebration, praise, but Maya could barely hear it over the roaring in her ears. She'd been right. After 3 years of studying in the margins of her life, after countless hours of research that no one valued, after being dismissed as sweetheart by men who didn't know half what she knew, she'd been right. The work had mattered. The intelligence counted. Being invisible didn't mean being wrong. And somewhere across the city, Gordon Hastings was losing a fortune on a short position he'd been too arrogant to close, learning an expensive lesson about the difference between confidence and knowledge. But that vindication felt strange, smaller than she'd expected, less satisfying than she'd imagined. Because the truth was, she hadn't won because Gordon was wrong. She'd won because she'd done the work, because she'd trusted her analysis, because she'd been willing to bet on herself when no one else would. The stock closed that day at $87.19. Maya's investment was worth $14,820.30. She'd made $6,814.95 in profit, more money than she'd ever had at once in her entire life. That night, she called Carlos. "I was right," she said simply. "I know, mija. I saw the news. Are you going to sell?" "Not yet. FDA approval is still coming. There's more upside." "Then I hope you're ready to keep holding, because now you're playing with house money, and that's when it gets dangerous." Maya understood what he meant. It was easy to hold when you were losing. Desperation forced patience. It was harder to hold when you were winning, when every dollar gain felt like a dollar that could be lost, when the fear of giving back profits created its own kind of panic. But she wasn't selling yet. She'd done the research, she trusted the thesis, and she was tired of being small, of playing it safe, of accepting that people like her should be grateful for scraps, while people like Gordon Hastings gambled millions on hunches and insider whispers. She had proven she could be right. Now she was going to prove she could be patient, too. 3 months later, Maya sold her GeneMedix shares at $118 per share, turning her $8,000 into $20,060. She paid off her mother's medical debt, enrolled in online finance courses, and kept working at Bellissimo, but now by choice, not necessity. Gordon Hastings lost $2.3 million on a short position before finally covering. He never returned to Table 17. The real victory wasn't the money. It was the night Maya's mother held her hand and said, "You taught yourself to see what others couldn't. That's worth more than any stock price." Maya still checked market data obsessively, still studied in the margins of her life. But now she did it with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven, to herself if no one else, that intelligence without credentials still counted, that being invisible didn't mean being wrong. She'd gambled everything on a single conviction. She'd won. But more importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the biggest risk isn't losing money. It's never betting on yourself at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.